New Year's Eve is supposed to feel safe. It's supposed to be one of those nights where families gather, people eat too much, children fall asleep before midnight, and everyone tells themselves that the new year might finally bring something better. But on one New Year's Eve in a quiet Michigan neighborhood, that sense of comfort was shattered by a burst of gunfire that would expose a betrayal so cold, so calculated, and so deeply personal, it left an entire community stunned. This wasn't a random killing. This wasn't a robbery. And it wasn't a case of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. What happened to Sergeant Tyrone Hassel III was the result of a plan. A deliberate, sickening conspiracy that had been building quietly behind closed doors. And at the center of it all was the one person who should have protected him the most: his own wife. When officers arrived at the home that night, the scene was already chaotic. A woman was screaming. Family members were gathering. Neighbors had started stepping outside. And in the driveway, slumped near a pickup truck, was 23-year-old Sergeant Tyrone Hassel III, still alive but gravely wounded. He had been shot multiple times. The injuries were devastating. Blood covered the driveway and the side of the truck. Officers and paramedics rushed in, trying to move quickly, trying to stabilize him, trying to save whatever time was left. His wife, Kamaya, was hysterical. She was the one who had called 911. Through tears and panic, she told dispatchers that her husband had been shot. She said he had just brought food home. She said she and their little boy were inside eating when she heard gunshots. She said she ran out and found him lying there. To anyone watching in those first moments, Kamaya looked like exactly what she wanted people to believe she was: a terrified young wife whose husband had just been ambushed outside their home. At first, police had every reason to think this could be a robbery or maybe a mistaken identity shooting. The violence had been sudden. The attack happened outside, and in those early minutes, there was no obvious explanation for why a young active duty soldier home for the holidays would be targeted in his father's driveway. But as officers started locking down the scene, they quickly noticed things that didn't sit right. For one, nothing had been taken. Tyrone still had his belongings. His phone was there. His money was there. His keys were there. If someone had attacked him for robbery, why leave everything behind? Then there was the way the shooting itself happened. Multiple shell casings were scattered in the driveway. Bullet strikes suggested the shooter had been positioned in a very specific spot. Some rounds had gone into the garage, which helped detectives start reconstructing the attack. Tyrone appeared to have been shot from behind while standing near his truck, possibly just as he was about to leave again. The wounds were brutal. Shots to the head, face, neck, and upper body. It didn't look random. It looked personal. Whoever did this hadn't just wanted Tyrone dead. They wanted to make sure of it. Inside the home, officers made another urgent discovery. Tyrone and Kamaya's little boy, just over a year old, was still in the house. In the middle of all that fear and confusion, police cleared the residence and found the child unharmed. It was one small relief in an otherwise horrifying scene. Outside, the victim's father, Tyrone Hassel Jr., was struggling to process what had happened. His son had come home for the holidays. He was supposed to be safe. He was supposed to be surrounded by family. Instead, he was now being rushed away in critical condition after being gunned down in the driveway. And even in those early moments, his father said something that would linger with investigators. He insisted his son didn't have enemies. He said Tyrone walked a straight line. He wasn't known for drama. He wasn't the kind of person who moved recklessly or surrounded himself with trouble. The image everyone had of him was that of a disciplined young man, military, focused, responsible, and devoted to his family. That only deepened the mystery. If Tyrone had no enemies, then who would want to kill him? And why? As the investigation moved into its first stages, detectives started with the obvious. They worked the crime scene. They documented the shell casings. They studied the blood patterns and bullet holes. They interviewed people at the home. They asked whether Tyrone had any recent conflicts, any feuds, any arguments with anyone. Nothing obvious surfaced. Then detectives learned something that added a strange wrinkle to the case. Earlier that same day, Tyrone had gone to Walmart and purchased 9mm ammunition, the same caliber later used in the shooting. That immediately raised questions. Why was he buying ammunition? Was he worried about something? Had he felt threatened? Had he gotten into some kind of confrontation earlier in the day? Police moved fast on that lead and pulled Walmart surveillance footage. In the video, Tyrone was seen interacting with two other men at the store. For a moment, investigators wondered if maybe those two individuals had something to do with the murder. Maybe there had been an argument. Maybe some kind of feud had started there. But that lead fell apart just as quickly as it appeared. The two men turned out to be old high school friends. They had no connection to the killing. Once again, detectives were left with almost nothing. The next lead came from the victim's father. Desperate for answers, Tyrone Hassel Jr. started searching through social media himself. He looked over Facebook posts and conversations, trying to find anything suspicious, anything that might point investigators in the right direction. At one point, he came to believe that perhaps the killer had actually been looking for someone else, Tyrone's stepbrother, who had his own personal issues with other people. That theory was serious enough for police to chase. If the shooter had mistaken Tyrone for his stepbrother, it could explain why a seemingly innocent man was suddenly targeted. Detectives interviewed the stepbrother, then other people connected to him. They worked that angle for days. But once again, it went nowhere. The theory didn't fit. The stepbrother looked very different from Tyrone. There was no solid evidence linking his problems to the murder. And little by little, investigators were forced to accept the hard truth that this was not a random error. Tyrone was the intended target. By then, the pressure on detectives was growing. Every lead seemed to crumble. Every possible explanation ended in a dead end. In a small community, people were frightened and confused. A young soldier had been murdered in what looked like an execution, and no one could explain why. Then tips started coming in from the public. One of those tips mentioned a possible confrontation Tyrone had been involved in at a roller rink not long before the murder. A man known as Drama was mentioned. Detectives tracked down Tyrone's friends, brought them in, and asked detailed questions about what had happened that night. Had there been an argument, a threatening stare, a dispute that escalated more than people realized? But once again, that lead fizzled out. Witnesses gave vague accounts, but nothing strong enough to tie that encounter to the murder. It was just another name thrown into the storm, another possibility that dissolved under scrutiny. By now, detectives had spent days pulling at threads that led nowhere. And all the while, the real answer was standing much closer than anyone realized. One of the most important breaks in the case came from a resident near the crime scene. That witness reported noticing something strange on the night of the murder. A vehicle backed into the driveway of a vacant home nearby. It was an odd detail, the kind of thing many people might overlook, But this witness paid attention. They said the car appeared to return, turn off its lights, back into the driveway, and sit there for a while. Then the driver got out and walked away. Later, the witness heard gunshots. That detail changed everything. Detectives now had something concrete. A suspicious vehicle parked near the scene, possibly lying in wait before the murder. The car was described as a black four-door vehicle, and investigators moved quickly to trace it. Using license plate reader data and toll booth surveillance, they were able to identify the vehicle and place it in the area around the time of the shooting. The owner of that car was a man named Jeremy Quayler, and that name immediately raised alarms. Jeremy wasn't some random stranger from the neighborhood. He was in the military. In fact, he served in the same battalion as Sergeant Tyrone Hassel III. Now the case took a dramatic turn. This wasn't looking like street violence anymore. This wasn't about robbery or mistaken identity or a random enemy from back home. Detectives had just found a direct connection between the killer's car and the victim's military circle. So they coordinated with Army investigators at Fort Stewart and began interviewing people who knew both Jeremy and Tyrone. And very quickly, they uncovered the motive that cracked the entire case wide open. One soldier revealed that Jeremy and Kamaya had been involved sexually. Not casually rumored, not vaguely suspected, an actual affair. And according to those who knew them, that relationship had started while they were overseas in Korea. The affair was no minor detail. It was the hidden center of everything. Suddenly, the murder made horrifying sense. This wasn't a mystery attack on a good man with no enemies. This was something much worse. A love triangle, a betrayal, and potentially a murder for romance plot. Once detectives realized Kamaya and Jeremy had a history, Kamaya moved from grieving widow to critical suspect. Now they had to answer the question that would define the case. Was Jeremy a jealous outsider acting alone, obsessed with Kamaya and determined to eliminate her husband? Or was Kamaya part of it from the very beginning? The answer would come in one of the coldest confessions investigators would ever hear. When detectives sat Kamaya down and questioned her, they pushed hard. They told her they were going to go through her phone. They told her everything would come out eventually. And little by little, the facade began to crack. Kamaya admitted she and Jeremy had built a bond during her marriage to Tyrone. She described feeling overwhelmed, unsupported, and unhappy. She talked about the responsibilities of motherhood. She talked about feeling like Tyrone wasn't doing enough for her. She talked about how Jeremy made promises, that he would take care of her, help with the baby, give her attention, give her the kind of life she felt she deserved. And somewhere in that twisted emotional mess, murder entered the conversation. According to Kamaya, the idea started during their time in Korea. After an argument with Tyrone, she vented to Jeremy and said she didn't want to be with her husband anymore. She claimed Jeremy said he could handle that. At first, she said she didn't take him seriously. But that lie didn't last. Because the deeper she got into the confession, the clearer it became that she absolutely had taken it seriously. In fact, she had helped shape the plan. She admitted Jeremy would ask about Tyrone's schedule. He wanted to know where he was, what he was doing, whether he was alone. Kamaya fed him information. She told him when Tyrone would be out. She helped Jeremy find opportunities. She knew he was scouting. She knew he was waiting for the right moment. And on the night of the murder, she gave him exactly the opening he needed. Tyrone had gone out and came back with food for his wife and their child. That should have been an ordinary act of care. a husband bringing dinner home. But Kamaya used it to set him up. She communicated that Tyrone had returned. She knew Jeremy was nearby. She knew what could happen. And when Tyrone stepped back outside, Jeremy was ready. He ambushed him in the driveway and shot him multiple times. What made Kamaya's confession so disturbing wasn't just what she admitted. It was how she talked about it. There was no overwhelming grief, no horror at the fact that the father of her child had been executed, no deep anguish about the irreversible loss she had helped create. Instead, much of her language centered on herself, her needs, her frustrations, her emotional dissatisfaction. Even when detectives confronted her with the reality of what had happened, she kept circling back to how neglected she felt, how unloved she believed she was, how trapped she thought her life had become. At one point, she acknowledged that she knew about the plan and could have stopped it. But she didn't. Why? Because, in her own words, she feared losing Jeremy's love. That sentence says everything. Not fear for Tyrone, not fear for her son growing up without a father, not fear for the life she was helping destroy. She was worried about losing the man she was cheating with. It is hard to imagine a more selfish motive. And then, investigators uncovered another chilling layer. When Kamaya was asked whether Tyrone had life insurance, she reportedly mentioned that she would receive around $400,000 from the military following his death. That raised the possibility that money wasn't just an afterthought. It may have been part of the motive from the beginning. So now investigators had the full picture, an affair between Kamaya and Jeremy, a growing resentment toward Tyrone, a plan discussed over time, a coordinated setup on the night of the murder, and potential financial gain after Tyrone was dead. It was premeditated, it was personal, and it was unforgivably cold. While Kamaya was talking, Jeremy was being interviewed separately by investigators in Georgia. Unlike Kamaya, he said almost nothing. He invoked his right to remain silent, and the interview ended. But by that point, silence couldn't save him. The evidence was already mounting: the witness sighting, the vehicle near the scene, the plate data, the military connection, and Kamaya's confession tying him directly to the plan. The man who pulled the trigger and the woman who made it possible were both exposed. And for Tyrone's family, the betrayal was almost beyond comprehension. This was not just a murder. It was the destruction of trust at the most intimate level. Tyrone had been home for the holidays. He had been with family. He had been trying to care for his wife and child. And while he was doing that, his own wife was coordinating with another man behind his back. Even worse, she was close enough to the aftermath to perform grief in front of everyone. She called 911. She cried. She screamed. She stood near the ambulance. She looked like a victim, all while already knowing far more than she claimed. That kind of deception is what makes cases like this so haunting. It's not just the violence, it's the performance. The ability to stand among the grieving while secretly being one of the people who caused the grief in the first place. Eventually, the legal consequences came. Kamaya was arrested and charged with first-degree premeditated murder. The case against her was overwhelming, especially because of her own words. On August 29, 2019, roughly 8 months after Tyrone's murder, she was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jeremy Queller also faced justice. He pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and, on July 30, 2019, was sentenced to 65 years in prison. With parole eligibility not coming until an age he is unlikely to ever reach in any meaningful sense, his life is effectively over too. He later tried to undo his plea, but it didn't work. The courts were not persuaded. The case remained what the evidence had already proven it to be: a cold, planned murder. One of the most emotional moments connected to this case came later, when Tyrone's father spoke with Jeremy. And what makes that moment so unforgettable is the contrast between the father's pain and Jeremy's regret. Jeremy admitted that Kamaya wanted him to do it. He said he wanted her. He said he was blinded and thought it was love. He described her as manipulative and said she wanted the money. There was remorse in his words, but remorse after murder doesn't undo anything. Tyrone's father, despite unimaginable pain, showed a level of restraint and humanity that most people could never manage. He made it clear that nothing could bring his son back. Nothing could change the fact that the only place left to visit him was a grave. And that is the part no sentence can ever fix. Because prison can punish the killers, but it cannot restore the life they took. And Tyrone Hassel III was more than just a victim in a case file. He was a son, a father, a soldier, a young man with a future, a man who should have been remembered for the life he lived, not only for the way his life was stolen. There is something especially chilling about crimes like this because they force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the greatest danger does not come from strangers lurking in the dark. Sometimes it comes from the person smiling beside you, eating at your table, sharing your home, listening to your plans, learning your routine, and quietly helping your killer get into position. That is what makes this story so devastating. Tyrone did not die because of a random act of violence. He died because the woman he trusted most decided his life was in the way of the future she wanted. And for that reason, this case is not just about murder. It is about greed. It is about selfishness. It is about manipulation. It is about how resentment, entitlement, and deception can build behind a normal-looking life until one day they explode in irreversible violence. In the end, Kamaya and Jeremy destroyed multiple lives. They took Tyrone from his family. They left a child without a father. They forced parents to bury their son. And they threw away their own freedom for a fantasy built on betrayal. That fantasy did not last. It ended the way these twisted conspiracies often do, in interrogation rooms, prison sentences, and permanent loss. But for the people left behind, there is no clean ending. Only the lifelong weight of what happened in that driveway. Only the memory of a young man who should have lived. Only the realization that on a night meant for family, celebration, and hope, evil had already been invited in, and it was wearing a familiar face.